Good evening and hello everyone and welcome to tonight's talk among the Biodiversity series during this Lunasa Festival period. My name is Ryan Montgomery and I'm speaking to you from the past because this is a recording, but I will be talking to you about Northern Ireland's reptiles and amphibians. I work for the Dragons in the Hills project. It is a lottery heritage funded initiative who work very closely with Amphibian Reptile Group UK, Herpetological Society of Ireland and the Newry, Mourne and Down district councils. The project aims to reconnect the local communities back into our wilderness using these quite wonderful animals. So let's get into it. So first of all, what is a reptile? I'm sure many of you are already aware, but I'll just jog your memory very briefly. First thing to note is they're what we call cold-blooded vertebrates. So they have a spine. The cold-blooded doesn't necessarily mean that they actually have cold blood. It just means the other term to use is ectothermic, where they cannot regulate their body temperature in the same way that we mammals can. So they're completely at the mercy of their environment and have to move around the environment based on whether they need to be heated up or cooled down, respectively. They have scales or scutes in the crocodile. They come in all shapes and sizes, like the smallest chameleon in the world there, the nosy Hara leaf chameleon, to one of the smallest snakes in the world, the typhlops there on the left, and the Bothropsosaurus, one of the heavy hitters of the viper world. And then we've got our terrestrial tortoises and our ocean-dwelling turtles. And there are said to be over 9,000 species of reptile. Now, what is an amphibian? Again, they are ectothermic and vertebrates. They start their life cycles in water predominantly. They undergo metamorphosis, where they start on an egg or become a tadpole or an eft and then grow into a final adult form. And this includes frogs, toads, newts, salamanders and caecilians. And they're thought to be approximately 8,000 different species of amphibian. But of course, for both of these taxa of animal, this number is ever increasing the more we start to understand and explore the world even today. So, how many herps do we have in Ireland? Well, we've all heard the myth. I'm going to stick by it as a myth that St. Patrick chased away all the snakes. It is true, we have no snakes, but we do have one species of reptile, which is the common lizard, and we have two species of amphibian, which is the common frog and the smooth newt. So here it is, the common lizard, or its scientific name, Zootoca vivipara. It is a small active lizard from 12 to 15 centimeters, fully grown. They are the most widely distributed terrestrial reptile in the world, spanning from the UK all the way further east into parts of Siberia even, reaching that subarctic zone. And they have this round, small snout and 5 toes, which will become a little bit more relevant later on when we talk about the smooth newt. So the males will, and all lizards will emerge in March when the weather starts to change. The males would usually emerge slightly earlier than the females and colour up nicely, ready for the mating season, which will happen between March and April. The females will then become gravid between May and June and will become visibly swollen with their young and will give birth in July and August. And then they will then survive right through September and start thinking about hibernating in late October. So what's amazing about these lizards is they can tolerate up from minus 2.5 to 10 degrees Celsius and survive up to 2 months in those sorts of conditions. They can achieve this by reaching what's called the supercooling point of minus 3 degrees Celsius. This means they can withstand below freezing temperatures without themselves becoming a solid state, i.e. frozen, which is quite remarkable. They will overwinter under rocks, in deep leaf litter, in burrows of dung beetles, and even in where roots have decomposed, leaving a cavity in the earth. And they will stay in relative torpor and won't usually re-emerge until, again, late February, early March. But we did have one recording last year of a lizard emerging as early as January. Sometimes they will come up to bask and go back down again. Like I said, they're ectothermic, so they're completely at the mercy of their surroundings. They would commonly eat insects, spiders, lice, whatever they can get their little jaws around. Okay, and they come in a variety of colours. In the top left, you see the very rare melanistic lizard. In the bottom left, you'll see a very vibrant green male lizard, and they will get to these colours particularly at the start of the breeding season. Males also get, and you'll see later on, that they get a lovely orange underbelly, whereas the females stay relatively more pale. And on the right on the screen here, you will see a lovely female who's that more sort of golden, beige, orangey kind of colour. So they are very variable in colour. They are stunning. So the differences between male and female is quite difficult to distinguish, but this is a nice illustration because both of these lizards are quite similar in colour. So the first thing you'll probably notice is the pattern. The male on the left here has a more marbled kind of pattern throughout his body. The female has a very prominent vertebral stripe down the middle of her back and two paler lateral stripes. Usually there's a contrast on the back and the flanks in colour for the females, but in this case she's quite uniform. The second thing you may notice is they're both similar sizes, but the male's head is much larger. This is thought to be perhaps male combat or competing with other males for breeding. And also the copulation ritual between these lizards is somewhat brutal, where the male will latch on throughout the copulation until it's complete. So those are the differences between males and females predominantly. There's another thing that these lizards have adapted to do. I already told you they're capable of hibernating for extensive lengths of time and withstanding harsh winters. But they also get around this problem of reliably unreliable Irish weather by giving birth to live young. So like I said earlier, most reptiles, as you may know yourself, usually give birth to eggs, but the problem with that is you need to have the environment to be a pretty constant temperature for them to develop. So these lizards get around this, and their Greek name is vivipara, which literally means live bearing, which is quite something. So they will give birth, in some cases, up to 13 live young, but it's sort of anywhere between 5, 6 to maybe even 9. And they will first emerge as these tiny little black, about inch-long lizards. And then on the right, you'll see a juvenile a year later, and they will vary in color. It's almost a sort of copper, an oxidized copper color gradient going through it. And in this year stage, it's very difficult to tell if they're male or female. So you usually have to mature before you can tell the difference. An additional adaptation that lizards have is this ability to drop their tail, which is called autonomy. So they have the ability and these muscles that will pull apart during a reflexive muscle spasm under stress through what's called the fracture plane. If you look at the image there on the top left where you can see the lovely male's orange exposed belly, you'll also draw your attention to his tail, and you can almost see the exact line where his tail begins. That is where the fracture plane is, and that is where the sever happens. It's remarkable because there's absolutely no blood loss in this act. And when the tail regrows, it will consist of rod cartilages instead of the original skeleton. The tail will also not have the same stature, if you like, as the original tail. And if you look at the image in the top right, you will see a fully regrown tail of a common lizard that's looking in very good condition. And you can see that it is not quite to the same length or point that the original tail on the left is. In the bottom, you'll see there a female that I found earlier this year. You can see that her tail is quite short and black on the end. I would say that this happened earlier this year in spring, perhaps. And it will take them approximately 6 months to a year to fully regrow their tail. And if it does regrow in this rod skeletal format, they can still drop it in the future again and keep regrowing. It's quite amazing. So, where do our dragons live? They love sunny upland and lowland bogs, and heathland in particular is a favourite. So heather in the Mournes, there's heather in Mount Divis and grassland in Mount Divis, and even the sand dunes of Murlock Bay, and perhaps further north into things like Torella. We've also found they've got recordings in Enniskillen. We've actually got recordings in West Belfast and people's gardens that back on to Mount Divis. When you're out looking for these lizards in particular, I will give you more information on how to survey for them later on in the talk. But there's one thing you got to listen out for is the wisp of a tail. When you're walking amongst the heather, they're very small, like I said, and they're very secretive, and they select their basking spots very mindfully, if you like. And often you will hear them being disturbed by you walking past. You'll hear a little wisp in the vegetation. Okay. So our first of our amphibians is the common frog, Rana temporaria. They're widespread across the UK. They get to a size of approximately 6 to 9 centimeters, and they really do vary in color from olive to a brown to a green to an orange to yellow, and even right on through to a red. Now, similar to our lizards, and they overwinter and they hibernate from October until late January. Typically, they can stay in the bottom of pond mud and breathe through their skin during this period, or deep in leaf litter, and can survive up to 48 hours in frosted conditions. Again, they're pretty hardy, like the common lizard. So they will emerge in February, in spring, and then the males within a week or two are already causing quite the commotion. For about a week or two, they will get together and they will do lots of calls. In fact, I believe in the pond up in the Ring of Gullion is a great place to go and view the mating rituals of the common frog in particular, where they will just sing for 2 weeks straight, non-stop, waiting for females. Once they spawn over another week or two, they will disappear from the ponds, leaving their spawn behind, which is why it's hence the name temporary. They will only temporarily stay in the ponds before they become land-based again, more terrestrial-based. Common frogs are also quite opportunistic spawners, if you like. They would primarily prefer something like a pond or a large body of water, but if that isn't there, they will in fact just go into quite a puddle, just a very simple puddle, which would obviously not mean very good outcomes for those tadpoles. So during this spawning period, one frog can lay up to 2,000 eggs in these jelly-like capsules. Within 2 to 4 weeks, they will then emerge as tadpoles, which they will remain in that state for 14 to 16 weeks. They have external gills. They will feed on things like algae, detritus, and carrion, and essentially everything predates on these tadpoles. So 2,000 eggs, you're lucky if you get a 1% adult rate coming through, particularly if it's a small pond where newts are present too, because the newts seem to just eat all the tadpoles very, very quickly. But during this 14 to 16 week period of them being a tadpole, they will then reabsorb their gills, they'll develop their hind legs first, and their tail will eventually get smaller before they begin to emerge again in summer. What's remarkable about the tadpole stage in particular is if the conditions aren't favourable or they're quite late developing and it starts coming into autumn, they can then hold development again until the following spring, where they can have their chances to emerge as a froglet or an adult. And I've got a little video here for you of slow motion frog. So you can just see how much power they can generate from their rear legs, and that is a froglet that emerged this year from the pond, so it was quite small. So I thought it was quite cool. I found that on the way up Bloody Bridge, up Donard. And this brings us on to our final of our 3 reptiles and amphibians, which is the smooth newt. So they are very adaptable. They encompass a wide range of habitats, and interestingly, when they emerge in February, they only stay in the ponds during the mating season, which is from March until June. Here you'll see a male with a beautiful crest and spots and an orange underbelly, and you'll see a female in the bottom right there who's just quite uniform in colour. I'd just like to draw your attention to the 4 toes on the front legs and the 5 toes on the hind legs, and I'll get to why that's quite interesting in a moment. But what's very interesting about these newts in particular is how sophisticated their courtship is. So the males will only maintain the crest and coloration for the mating period, but during this time they will do a dance in front of their desired partner, and they will waft their scent in the water before depositing a spermatophore for her then to decide whether she wants to take that spermatophore to fertilize the eggs for herself or not. Now, what's fascinating about these newts is I mentioned they had 4 toes on the front and 5 on the back. That's because newts will painstakingly fold every single one of their eggs into a leaf over this period from March to June. So up to 600 eggs will be folded into plant life or plant or leaves in a pond, for example. Once this is finished, they will both re-emerge out of the pond and enter what I call the terrestrial phase here. And this is when both males and females look very similar. It's almost impossible to tell them apart unless you examine their anatomy a bit closer. And then they will just go off and start feeding and fattening up again for winter, ready to breed the next year. It actually takes nearly 3 years for a newt to sexually mature before they can themselves go to the pond and start the cycle all over again. They have a similar kind of sort of larval stages in terms of length as a frog, but interestingly they will grow their 3 feather-like gills to begin with, and then instead of the frog who grows their rear legs first, the newt will grow their front legs first, and then the rear legs come later. And similar to frog tadpoles, they can do a similar thing. Will put off their development for another year until conditions are more favourable in spring, if they need to. So where do amphibians live? Well, typically wetlands and peat bogs, ephemeral and permanent natural ponds. Ephemeral just meaning that in the winter and spring months, as long as it holds water and it dries up in summer, that's all these animals need to complete their reproduction cycle. Under logs, in the rocks, in tree bark of fallen trees, and even in your garden, frogs particularly are actually very adaptable and very good at surviving quite a lot of urban environments, provided that there is some sort of body of water or damp areas nearby. And something as simple as something the size of a kitchen sink is sufficient for a frog to complete its reproductive cycle. So any one of us can make a very simple pond that would be very helpful for all of our amphibians. So we're going to go on to the survey methods for dragons. So the first thing you'd really want to do is identify good habitat. In the top right, you'll see that's actually Eagle Mountain, and you can see a lovely, nice, dense part of heather and bracken. And if you look more closely at the image further to the right, this place is also sheep grazed, which tends to degrade the heather and the bracken, leaving just a very bare grass, which you typically don't find many lizards amongst. Not to say they're not there, but typically you don't find them there. But since there is quite a good abundant bit of heather here, this is probably a good place to survey to see if they're there. So the way you do it is using a visual survey by using your eyes. And you've got to think like a lizard. What that means is if they're ectothermic, as we now understand them to be, they require the sun to heat up their bodies, particularly in this cold weather that we get quite a lot of the time. So you want to find some of this south facing in particular. The Mourne wall can be perfect. If you find a part of the granite wall that's south facing with a good little bit of vegetation growing up under the side of it with some exposed parts for a little lizard to bask perfectly, that's a good place to look. You really want to walk slowly and scan for places that look very good for basking, because they are very hard to spot. And there's a little image there in the middle of a female just sat on a fence post, and it is so easy to miss these lizards, which hence why you got to walk slowly. And like I said earlier, when you listen carefully, you can sometimes hear them disappearing. If you think you spotted one or heard one, if you just take note of the space and the place, they almost always return within 5 to 10 minutes and start basking in exactly the same place. So where are they? So this was a map created by my predecessor, Josh, who did a lot of work in the Ring of Gullion last year. The project has now moved more towards and focusing on the Mourne region. However, since 1973 to 2020, you can see that there are, in the green is the newts and the purple is the common lizard. You can only see there's only 3 spatially independent newt sightings or records. There are 0 lizards in the Strangford area. And the Ring of Gullion at this point in time only had 1 lizard record and 5 newt records, and in the Mournes there were 16 lizards and 10 newt records. Of course, people are saying far more newts and lizards, but very little of it makes it back to these records or this data that's available out there, which is why it's so important to try and educate all of us. The citizen science is crucial, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But this year, I'm happy to report that we now have 99 lizard sightings all over Northern Ireland, 70 of which occurred within 2021, particularly in the Mourne region where there was only 16 as far as we were last year. And we now have 78 smooth newt, and you can see that they really are expansive and everywhere. You'll also note that the project's moving into Strangford next year. One thing that's very interesting about Strangford, in my view, is you have a lot of the drumlins and the islands that are exposed. It would be very, very cool for us to see if there are lizards on any of those islands. But you can see they are sequestered to the Mourne region, which is beautiful heather. Here's Murlock Beach, just further north. You've got the Ring of Gullion down here, which has good habitats. Then you get into Mount Divis here in West Belfast, up to Carrick, and they also do very well in Sea Cliffs up in the north, just facing Rathlin Island here. So why citizen science is so important is that we can ask really interesting questions like, I showed you an image of that female lizard that had dropped her tail. We could see things between different habitat types. So take somewhere like in the Mournes, it has pristine heather, and we survey for lizards and get X amount of lizards. They all have perfectly good tails. What if we go to somewhere that's been sort of grazed quite heavily, somewhere like Eagle Mountain where I found that lizard with a dropped tail? Could we then start to get actual differences in the populations and the frequency in which they drop their tails because they're becoming more exposed because of their degraded habitat? So we can ask lots of very interesting questions with just very simple citizen science with people like yourselves going out and finding them for yourself and reporting back. It could be very, very fascinating, very interesting. There's so much more that we still need to learn. It'd be great to know that if there are any suboptimal habitats where these lizards and newts and frogs are surviving, like I just said on this map in particular, they are sequestered to the Mournes, Ring of Gullion, Divis, even Scrabble Tower up in Newton Nards. There are some lizards there. But it'd be nice or interesting to know if there's any populations in between these main pockets. For the future of these populations to survive, you would really like to have some kind of gene flow between different meta populations, and we just don't know if that's happening. And I have to thank all of our wonderful volunteers, from Philip to Gregory to Rob to Ryan to James to myself to Stephen. Together, well, at least the volunteers managed to rack up a collective 99 hours, which is just astonishing for just this season. And I started quite late in May, so I'm hoping next season that I can get even more volunteers, get more people trained up, more people excited, give them more skills, and who knows how many lizard or newts that we could uncover and get everyone as excited about them as I am. Well, thank you for listening. If you'd like to find out more about our common lizard, smooth newt, or common frog, you can follow us and find us on Facebook and Twitter, which is Dragons in the Hills, and keep an eye out for future events. In fact, this weekend we are holding a 2-day event in Silent Valley where we'll be doing reptile rambles, taking groups to look for lizards within Silent Valley. If you don't find the real lizards, I've got plastic ones hidden amongst the root to keep us entertained. And in future, if you do see a lizard or a newt of your own, please record and report the sightings either to me directly on the Facebook pages or my email address, which I can share with you afterwards. I can also tell you how to report and record sightings on our database called Record Pool, and CDAR is another one that is excellent for recording sightings. So without another word, just to say thank you to our sponsors, the Natural Heritage Fund, and of course the help from the Newry, Mourne and Down district councils for their support all throughout the project. And I believe I will be handing myself to my future self for any questions that you may have. Please ask as many questions as you like. I'm happy to answer. So thank you very much for coming and listening.